Imagine that you go outside one morning, and a dense fog covers everything you know. The sun above gives only a gray light, and you shiver with cold, and then imagine that that fog remains for the next day and the next. The sky remains the color of dead skin. The next week, the next month, 18 months of jumbled seasons. Welcome to the year 536 AD, what Harvard historian Michael McCormick calls the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. Justinian was ruling from Constantinople and sending troops to recover Rome from the Goths, and around the world we find record of mysterious, destructive weather. An administrator in Rome named Cassiodorus recorded his observations in a letter. The sun, first of stars, seems to have lost his light and appears of a bluish color. We marvel to feel the mighty vigor of his heat wasted into feebleness. The moon, too, even when her orb is full, is empty of her natural splendor. Strange has been the course of the year thus far. We have had a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. Whence can we look for harvest, since the months which should have been maturing the corn have been chilled by Boreas? How can the blade open if rain, the mother of all fertility, is denied to it? You see the problem. Without our means of preserving food, a horrific change in weather was bound to cause a food shortage. Indeed, in the writings of Procopius from the other end of the continent, we read, "The sun during this whole year seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war, nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death." Scientists have done a lot of analysis on what could have caused the catastrophe. The best candidate appears to be a volcanic eruption in Iceland. The clouds blanketing the northern hemisphere led to snow in China's summer and crop failure in Ireland, even drought in South America. Cassiodorus wondered where God was in these events. Since the world is not governed by chance, but by a divine ruler who does not change his purposes at random, men are alarmed, and naturally alarmed, at the extraordinary signs in the heavens, and ask with anxious hearts what events these may portend. He didn't want to blame God for it, saying, "It would be wrong to construe all this as an omen of divine wrath." I'm recording this during the coronavirus event of 2020, and nobody knows what's going to happen next. We've looked at Italy's numbers, and they're scary. Right now the questions are coming up as to whether some of the scary factors have been exaggerated. Only time will tell. Every death from the Wuhan flu is terrible, but at least so far it doesn't compare with disasters before our time. You still might ask, where's God in all this? And so here's a parable from Jesus, starting with Matthew 24:45. "Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions." The context of this story is Matthew 24. Jesus is teaching on the end of time in response to his disciples' questions about the destruction of the temple and the end of the age. He warns them about religious deception, natural and man-made disasters, and the persecution of his people. And he promises someday to come back for his people, the second coming of Christ. Jesus goes on to share several parables about being ready for the end of history as we know it, including this story. The servant has choices in how to carry out his responsibilities. What are those responsibilities? Well, the servant is a sort of steward over other servants in the house. He calls the shots, we might expect, while the master is gone, but Jesus doesn't mention what the servant was telling the others to do, only that this servant is supposed to give them their food at the proper time. The servant that is in charge is to serve the other servants. Or at least that's what he's supposed to do. Jesus' parable goes on, "But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, 'My master is staying away a long time.' And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So the servant can care for his charges or abuse them, and then see to his own pleasures. Did you notice something else having to do with the servant's choices? It has to do with time. In the first option, he pays attention to the time in order to make sure his charges are fed on schedule. But in the second, he is watching the clock to see what he can get away with. He thinks, "The Lord is delaying his coming," and lives his life accordingly. Have you ever been preoccupied with the timing of Jesus' return? It's hard not to in some ways if you love him and want to see him. It's even worse for Adventists since we're sort of the last holdouts of an historicist view of prophecy, namely, the events of Revelation unfold over time. But if we assign dates to various events, even when we're correct, we still end up wondering, since Jesus hasn't come back, if the Lord is delaying his coming. It's the wicked servant that says that. It's not that every follower of Jesus who thinks about the delay is on the verge of beating up his fellow Christians. I would say that a lot of the stuff that goes on in congregations that's not appropriate would stop immediately if we thought that Jesus could come any time. It's just that, as a teacher of mine used to say, all the time, probably still does, something goes wrong in the human heart when we think we have extra time. I happen to think that God's primary means of working in the world is through his people, especially in times of crisis. It's good to ask God to move in history, in the events and the hearts of leaders. The Bible encourages that. But maybe it's better to ask God for both the strength and the wisdom to intervene in the ways he would if he were here, to run towards the trouble and do our small part to ease the suffering. In that case, each of us has the same choice as the servants. Are we going to look after those around us, or are we going to wail on each other and see to our own pleasure? I say this all the time, and I'm going to say it again. Our culture is afraid to talk about death, and that means we're often unprepared when it happens, especially when it's a surprise. I suppose COVID-19 could mutate into Captain Trips and kill 99% of the world's population. Guess what? You were going to die anyway. Here's a great passage from C.S. Lewis writing about the new fear in his time of nuclear weapons. In one way, we think a great deal too much of the atomic bomb. How are we to live in an atomic age? I am tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in a Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night, or indeed as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, an age of motor accidents. In other words, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Believe me, you and all whom you love were already sentenced to death before the atomic bomb was invented, and quite a high percentage of us were going to die in unpleasant ways. We had indeed one very great advantage over our ancestors, anesthetics, but we have that still. It's perfectly ridiculous to go on whimpering and drawing long faces because the scientists have added one more chance of painful and premature death to a world which already bristled with such chances, and in which death itself was not a chance at all, but a certainty. Everybody is either going to die or be alive when Jesus comes back, and either way, that's the end. Whether or not you were expecting it, it's best to be ready. That's why Jesus says, so you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. That's how the parable starts. Started out talking about a volcanic eruption leading to crop failures around the world. That event also paved the way for the bubonic plague that ravaged Europe for the next 1,000 years, beginning in Justinian's reign and continuing on through the Renaissance. Centuries later, a Cistercian monk observed the two choices of Jesus' parable in action among his fellow clergy as they dealt with the Black Death in their time. And in many towns, great and small, the priests were terrified and fled, but some others, considerably braver, administered the sacraments. Soon, in many places, out of every 20 inhabitants, there were only 2 alive. And the holy sisters of Hôtel Dieu, having no fear of death, discharged their task to the end with the most perfect gentleness and humility. These sisters were wiped out by death and were replaced more than once. And they now, as is believed, repose in peace with Christ. So whether it's the crisis of the moment I'm recording this or a totally different one by the time you see it, the question is, how does God want me to serve those around me? What does being faithful look like right now? Thanks for watching.